So I want to start with a provocative question, if you will, okay? It involves both in terms of ethics and justice as well as some practical issues. I think it's provocative. We'll see, or at least you'll make it provocative, right? So we have been talking about protection, right? Access is about protection of vulnerable audience, where we are trying to bring people together, bring resources together and programs together and policies together to really promote access to a particular group of people who we think are vulnerable. So I want to take it in the other direction. We do have access, quote unquote access, to risk-causing industries which are also focusing on vulnerable people. So I mentioned the example of tobacco advertising, right, tobacco marketing. In the US alone, I think the last figures we had was in 2013, where they spent somewhere close to $9 billion in pushing tobacco, right? As one senator said, when you talk about $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking about real money, right? So my question is, what is it can we do on the other side to protect people from this risk-promoting, risk-causing industries in health, which actually target vulnerable audiences? I'm just curious what, we have panelists who are ethicists, or industrialists, who are epidemiologists, as well as policymakers. So I thought we'll start with that. Dr. Cherny, and then Dr. Hamid.
Though I live and work in Israel, I was born in Australia and brought up in Australia. And I remember in my late adolescence when the billboards advertising cigarettes all changed to billboards advertising against tobacco. And this was promoted through the taxation on cigarettes, and that money was dedicated to health promotion. So the large taxes that were put on cigarettes, which themselves were a disincentive, that money was channeled specifically to the purpose of health education and discouraging smoking. Yesterday morning, I took a tour through the slums, and one of the things that I was saddened and astounded to see was in every corner the little booths selling chewing tobacco in beautiful, coloured, bright, shiny packets. It strikes me that we have a long way to go here in terms of controlling the issue of point-of-sale marketing, and I think that really unless India really takes this to heart and says, look, this is going to stop, and there will no longer be shiny packets. Whether if you're going to market chewing tobacco, still in plain brown packaging, as they do with cigarettes in Australia, covered in warnings. But I don't know the strength of the political strength of the manufacturers of chewing tobacco, but the prevalence and the prominence of it is to an outsider is absolutely striking.
Dr. Hamid and then Dr. Anderson. Did you want to say something?
No, I'd raised it earlier with you that when you say tobacco and chewing tobacco and cigarette smoking, are you condemning nicotine itself or not? Because we are the largest producer in India of nicotine chewing gum,
Yes.
a deterrent to smoking. Mm-hmm. So I think you should make the distinction between whether smoking causes cancer or chewing tobacco causes cancer, or is nicotine by itself harmful or not? Or is it the lesser of the two evils?
Right. So I think, so you put me on a tough spot. I'm the one who's supposed to ask the questions, right? Right. But since I have the floor, I can easily wiggle myself out of this to say, and Dr. Ono, I think, will be rescuing me shortly in a second here. But as I said, we were exchanging notes, Dr. Hamid and I. Nicotine is not the issue, I think, per se. though there is a big debate brewing in the US on e-cigarettes, it's themselves a huge debate. It has split the public health community in the middle. But our focus is on chewing and smoking tobacco, where, as I said, I use the term malevolent. I don't know what else to do. My English is very poor. I could use even a stronger term for the way they have been pushing. But I think it's just not one industry I want to focus on. So sugar-sweetened beverages, for example, are now considered are very risky in terms of the consumption and leading to obesity. And that is being taken up in great quantities in India. So in general, I'm thinking about as a question, I think they're ethically very difficult. So it looks like Dr. Anderson, Ms. Mahajan, Dr. Ono after that. And it looks like, welcome Dr. Sareen, you are, at some point I'm going to draw you in to talk about these things. So.
I think there are two separate topics here. One was a scientific question about what causes the disease, and you did an excellent question. Is it nicotine? Is it smoke? What is it? And then, but that wasn't actually the question you asked. The question you asked is, what do we do about this? And the role of government is, can be very challenging. I live in a country where tobacco is produced, and if one is a politician in a tobacco state, you're talking about the livelihood of your voters, and I can understand that that's a difficult issue. Ultimately, we want to steer government in the right way, but I think this is the role for NGOs. So I'm on the board of director of the Union for International Cancer Control, UICC, and UICC has driven a series of activities that I think have been quite significant and powerful. So for example, World Cancer Day was started by UICC, and they've actually backed their label away from it so that it doesn't, so that it is used more extensively. And the World Cancer Day had more than 17 billion electronic communications that took place last February 4th. UICC has influenced, they were the driver actually behind the essential medicines revision that WHO performed. Because I think the idea that we think that that if you tell people the science, then they'll do the right thing. Scientists think that. But actually, we just went through an election in my country that made it very clear that knowledge and truth is not the driver of what makes people do things. And so what I'm getting at is that this is where advocacy groups communicating to the public, they can make messages and packaging and communication that will drive the public in ways that I don't think physicians can, don't think the scientific community can. And we want to organize and make sure that our messaging is well done. That's what's changed tobacco in my country. Tobacco is now, tobacco is looked down on as in most circles. That was a social movement, not a governmental one.
Sure. So let me, before we go to Dr. Ono and then Ms. Mahajan, I do think while it was social movements in US, it is also the government which has played a very critical role. That was one place where the social movement organizations and government came together. For example, the CDC's entire Office of Smoking and Health has been developing the empirical evidence based on NIH's funding. And my own former program from NIH funded a ton of these interventions on tobacco, I think. So the question is, if we if we decide that this is a problem, and can we go after that? And I completely agree that it is advocacy organizations. That's a great point. Dr. Ono?
Thank you very much for pointing me. I truly agree that it is not the science, but the emotion which changes the people's behavior. I just want to make a brief example of our country's situation about in terms of the tobacco control. We do have the carrot and stick approach that the previous speakers mentioned. On the carrot side, we have included the treatment of the anti-tobacco and then apply the nicotine gum for the medical use is now under covered by our national health insurance scheme that Dr. Matsuda has explained earlier this morning. And now we see so many advertisements on TV shown by the pharmaceutical company encouraging the people to stop tobacco. maybe alarming sign for tobacco. Anyway, it's a sunshine
We
part.
are being screened.
Okay. And the stick part, we do have introduced a kind of a card which we will flash it into the vending machine of tobacco. That, as you see that in Japan, that we have so many vending machines in any kind of products, but tobacco is one of the three. So we have issued a card so that to the only adults, so that the minors cannot buy tobacco anymore easily by the vending machine. I just wanted to say two examples about it.
Great.
Thank you.
Ms. Mahajan?
I hope I have Dr. Pankaj's permission to say that Punjab is one of the leading anti-tobacco states, including banning and e-cigarettes before the rest of the world had decided that they may be dangerous. However, I wanted to take the discussion beyond tobacco and to make a more general point. Health-seeking behavior is one of the things I think we really struggle with. One of the most difficult challenges is not even, and I had actually wanted to say that in my presentation as well, access to healthcare, the most difficult challenge is not even provisioning, challenging though that is. It is making people come and receive health services, whether it is because of poverty, because the loss of a day's wage is of very significant value. People tend to value the short term more than the long term. But the fact of the matter is you can provide free treatment when we are the only state in the country which is providing free treatment for hepatitis C, and we are very proud that we are providing the same medicines as in the US. We are, it's PGI people, we have used the ecosystem, so the specialists are fully trained and all of that. The success rate is amazing. We are delighted that we have 20,000 patients who are currently or have been treated, but we estimated 1 lakh. So we only have, in 6 to 8 months of start of the scheme, where are the rest of the 80,000 people? We started a free annual preventive health check scheme at every community health center. It's not too far. Punjab has very good roads, infrastructure, it's easy to access. We are happy. We get about 4,000 people every week. We do this every Saturday. 4,000 every Saturday is not bad. Numbers add up very quickly. But where are the rest? So IEC, BCC, and generally pushing for health change behavior, I think government needs to keep playing a role. It has to. Many of these efforts have to be publicly financed, tax financed. But I think there is a huge, huge need for not just civil society and NGOs, but perhaps also CSR from the best of the marketing companies, the best advertising companies to come forward to do, successful campaigns. We have shown that we can do things, for instance, polio. When we put our heart and minds to it, we have succeeded in so many things, but it's really a smallpox, polio, maternal tetanus. But it's hard to change behavior, and especially in the context of NCDs. I think we need much more stakeholder getting together and doing it as a mission, because otherwise it's not working very well.
Right. I see, Mr. Srivastava, you were shaking your head at some point. Did you want to jump into this?
Well, I made the mistake of shaking my head. As my friends in America tell me that it's a bad Indian habit, which I haven't been able to shake off. But coming back to it, I definitely agree with the previous speaker about the need for getting the stakeholders together. And there's a lot of experience that I can recall and remember, and two that come to my mind very much. One is during the family planning campaign, the early days of the family planning campaign. There was a tremendous effort that went between the public sector and the private sector to see how to take something which was very difficult and culturally not acceptable to become acceptable, and including things like getting a condom put into small stall, which is also not selling, cigarette stall and rest of it. So I think that was one example. But I hope we hear a little about it tomorrow on the panel, that there was also before that, or around the same time, there was the satellite instruction television experiment, which actually took the content of healthcare and health issues down into the homes across the country. It was, and I think there was a lot of experience that was gathered at that point in time. We need to look at it because it's not a matter of marketing, which I get very worried. Because when you talk of marketing, you're talking of selling something, and as we have heard Dr. Badwe and everybody else, you're not selling anything, you're marketing. And when you're marketing an idea that said that you're wanting the person to come to receive, partake of that services that might be available in demand, perhaps serve as an auditor of the service. And I think that requires a tremendous amount of education. And being as old as I am, I remembered Professor Swaminathan telling me when I was a young man, he says, you know, I was talking about literacy, that if people in the rural areas were literate, they will understand some of the things that they need to understand. And I think, if I remember Dr. Swaminathan turning around to me and saying, young man, you realize how much the person, the peasant or a common villager needs to know. He needs to know meteorology, he needs to know horticulture, he knows economics and everything. So it's not going to be the alphabetization which is going to get it there. How do we embed that concept into that? And I think that is something which is beginning to be missing all over because we have created a divide between the private and public sector. The private sector knows how to sell things. And the public sector wants to get the private sector to do what private sector does, but you're not selling tobacco. You're telling people don't smoke. I mean, there are two different order of magnitude. So I think we need to seriously look at that, creating that kind of mindset, health-oriented mindset across. Whichever.
Great. Thank you. So I want to open it up for people to ask questions if they have questions. So understand a few people are going around with microphones. So are there questions? So there's one here to start with.
Yeah. Yes, it was a long time ago, but at the beginning of this panel, there was a lot of talk about pharmaceutical pricing. And I wanted to ask the panelists if you think there's market failure in pharmaceutical, and if there is, how widespread is it, and how should we think about addressing it?
The Medicare laws, the Medicare regulation Part D, is an absolute suspension of market forces, an absolute suspension. So, which, as I said, has global consequences. And unless there is the political willingness for the American government to take responsibility for what is a global catastrophe as a result of these protections of pharmaceutical industry interests, we continue to be screwed internationally.
Dr. Hamid.
In India, I have said on pricing of medicines, if a drug is manufactured by more than 5 companies, it should be free of price control, as competition ensures that water finds its own level. I've said in India that those drugs that are sold under monopoly or sold under patent should be kept under price control. Unfortunately, our government doesn't see it this way. It's very sad. They're looking at an essential drug list, which includes drugs like paracetamol, etc., made by dozens of companies. And I think maybe we have somebody from the government next to me here. Maybe she can influence the government to have price control on monopoly drugs, and no price control on drugs that are freely available.
So should I put Ms. Mahajan on the spot and say,
I think there is definitely an element of market failure in pharma. And that's largely because of asymmetries of information. When a doctor prescribes a particular product, the patient has to trust the doctor. And if it's a brand name that's been prescribed, the patient will go and buy that particular brand name. If the doctor just writes the genetic formulation, it is the chemist who decides what to push. And I think Amit, that's probably one reason why the marketing margins in the pharma sector are so incredible. I mean, what other product do we know that has such high marketing margins that when Dr. Budway or we as state government put out a tender for buying pharma for our essential drug list, a 1 lakh product comes down to 21,000 rupees and nobody is making a loss there. So the rest of the thing, I don't believe that's extortionist, I don't believe that's a margin that only the pharma company is retaining. I think that's basically going into the entire chain, starting from the doctor to the chemist to the pharma representatives and all of that. So there is definitely an issue there. The problem is that we keep talking about generic drugs, and you're often asked, why don't you make it mandatory for government doctors, for instance, to write generic drugs and so on. I think until we can fix our regulatory system, there will always be some lack of confidence in generic drugs. The average citizen, and that will perhaps include you and me, we will not be sure whether this particular company that is making paracetamol, for instance, whether it's actually paracetamol or it's chalk, or how much of it is chalk and how much of it is paracetamol.
That's what the government should be doing.
Exactly right. So,
That's you.
yes.
And if your government is today not putting pressure on the regulatory,
So on that, so there is one more question here. I know a few other people want to jump in, but maybe we'll give an opportunity for the audience.
I thought this was a terrific panel. I did want to raise a question because it hadn't been brought up that much. One of the things that we've heard about is the cost, the expense, the use of drugs and so forth. But balancing that is how effective they are, what's their life expectancy extension and so forth. And part of that is actually clinical research and evidence for the utility of those drugs. As you know, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is required by law to approve a drug when it has any activity. And I always use that example that if I was in a foot race against Usain Bolt in about 5 feet, you would clearly know that he was superior to me, but I could always claim he only beat me by 3 feet. So the question is, if you are trying to get what is the true benefit of some of these medicines, where is that evidence going to come from? We know with the implementation of the electronic medical record, less than 30% of electronic medical records have even the clinical stage of the cancer in the U.S. So the EMR is not the solution. So it's, some type of clinical research or structured databases and so forth. What's the role of the world that is benefiting from these medicines to try to develop evidence about their best use and their toxicities and how good they really are? That balance of responsibility as we get access to these medicines.
So maybe a quick response.
It's 2 points. One is the issue. The threshold for licensing is incredibly low, and it encourages and that's tied in with the fact that if once the drug is licensed, it must be provided without negotiation on price. Sets up this whole perverse cycle. There's been debate of trying to raise the bar, but this would require changing the mandate for organisations such as the FDA and the EMA, and it would be a fairly radical step. What is extremely disappointing is that when people have recently looked at the targeted thresholds for a whole range of current studies in the field of oncology, only 30% of them reach the level that these are the targeted thresholds which would be credited by the ESMO clinical benefit scale as being substantial. So most of the targets are sitting really at a fairly low threshold. So these are cultural changes that are going to be required in a regulatory setting, in the whole manner in which we license medications, and again, unless we change the incentives, we're going to be stuck in the same rut.
Great. Dr. Anderson, did you want to say something?
2 brief points. I agree with you that what's happened in the U.S. with not negotiating on prices is a real problem. I think it's very strange that our pharmaceutical companies market directly to the public. If you come to the U.S. and watch our pharmaceutical ads on TV, it is bizarre. But the idea that 2 points. One is you raised the point that we now have targeted biological therapies. Targeted therapies that are antibodies, that you, sir, I know you would know this much better than I. It's different to make biological entities than it is a drug, where it's a chemical. And the costs are truly different between those, that they're two separate pieces. But the point I want to raise is that you can do price control. The companies are not forced to manufacture the drugs. This is a clinician, I've seen them run out of strange things like normal saline. Why are we running out of normal saline? Why can we not get isosulfan blue? The companies may stop making things for their own reasons because they actually are working in a market economy. So the assumption that we'll create rules and then they'll keep grinding out the drugs, I don't think that that's true. This is going to require some very sophisticated thought, and I think it goes beyond just the price discussion, not because the price isn't justified, but because we are talking about a market economy.
Right. Wonderful. So we are maybe 30 seconds.
May I interrupt for a
Go
second?
ahead, please.
I think America is different, but for India, we had a very strong public sector drug industry, pharmaceutical industry, which virtually has died, which is very, very sad. Some months ago, the government of India asked me, suppose there's a war between China and India, and drugs from China stopped coming to India, what happens? I said, we would shut down. Same America. If India and China somehow jointly said, we will not supply medicines to the world pharma industry would shut.
Wonderful.
So what I told the Indian government, that for key areas, you have to manufacture in the public sector. This is a thing for you. You have, for example, we had Hindustan Antibiotics in Pune, producing penicillin. How many penicillin producers are there in the world today? And what is the impact of penicillin, which is used today to make 6-APA? From that you make ampicillin, amoxicillin, 7-ADCA, cephalexin, the whole series. How many companies in the world are producing penicillin? If China today stopped supplying penicillin, and the intermediates that go into making the antibiotics, believe me, the world would be in a sorry state of affairs. And this is a very serious thing for India, that with our population, 1.65 billion, we cannot afford items like penicillin not being produced in India, and that is a role I sincerely believe has to be tackled by the government on a war footing.
Thank you, Dr. Hamid. That was very good, helpful. So I only lost partial control of the session. So, but that was very provocative, very interesting. So what I want to do is give the privilege to Mr. Sareen to weigh in on this topic for a couple of minutes. Then I want to invite him to come and give his talk after that, and then thank the panelists after that. So.
Thank you, and sorry I missed some part of it. I want to give a different perspectives of who is denied of access to health care. You're talking of tobacco. Look at the alcohol guy. I'm a liver guy. So a person who drinks alcohol and has liver disease, he doesn't get a liver, he doesn't get a transplant listing, he doesn't get an insurance, and as of now, 47% of our admissions in the hospital are due to alcohol and liver disease. Government wants to sell alcohol to raise revenue, I'm sorry to say.
Right.
True in Punjab also.
Right.
It's true in Delhi also. I'm not sure of Mumbai. Mumbai, I have no idea. But you sell alcohol the patient falls sick, not that the government makes them sick, but the issue is he's denied. The second group of people who are denied treatment or jobs globally for which we are fighting is hepatitis B. Hepatitis B, 99% is mother-baby. But you go and ask for a visa for Middle East, you want for a job, you want insurance, you will not get insurance. You will not get jobs, you will not get a passport, or even maybe admission to TMH. Will you take a doctor who is HB positive? Well, you are ahead of time like us. But you go to, let's say, Royal Free, you will not get a job in UK or Europe. So there are two groups, or similarly many other groups who are denied treatment for no reason, and I think this may not be the right opportunity, but I want you to be sensitized. On the other hand, self-inflicted things like obesity, you will get a liver, you will get a transplant, you will get a treatment. For lung cancer, which is out of, maybe partly responsible by smoking, you will get treatment. So I think healthcare access on a bigger spectrum must be clear that it is not to be denied to anybody who is sick. Do you agree to that?
Thank you, Mr. Sarin. That was very helpful. So, two things. Let me first thank the panelists for the wonderful remarks.